Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Beneath the Transaction podcast. This is the first time ever in my history of hosting a podcast that our footage was somehow lost. So, so Sean, we've been here before together, you and I. Listeners, this is the first time, but we actually did record an entire session, and the software we used, it just did not upload properly. So here we are again, and I'm glad that you took the time to do this again with me. Again, in the spirit of transparency, I'm just letting everybody know this. It's also kind of humorous, but I am very grateful that you're willing to come back on the show and have another great conversation. I'm your host, Chris Pineda. Tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and the area that you cover, things of that nature. But also, what I found really unique last time we spoke was kind of your journey of getting here and how you developed a passion around the work that you do. Of all the HR systems and things aside, those things are needed. The human side of it and the culture side of it,
Yeah.
how you got
Yeah.
to kind of developing a passion for that.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Yeah. Listen, my pleasure to be back. Listen, this is great. Thanks for having me back.
Of course.
So yeah, I'm vice president of HR for Captain D's and covers all areas of HR that you would expect, benefits, payroll, compliance, employee relations, operational support, all those things. And Captain D's is mostly Southeast QSR brand. Been around for 50 years. We have about 500 restaurants, about 300 corporate owned, another couple hundred franchised. And I support the corporate side of that as well as our franchisees in a support capacity, directly responsible for the HR components for about 5,000 employees across the Southeast in our restaurants. I had this journey. I wound up here, spent the first part of my career in retail, working my way up right out of high school, and a small multi-unit responsibility role, and then kind of fell into HR as most of us do, with some compliance audits and some, recruiting and things like this, and really found what I love to do. I found I had a passion for contributing to the business. Always loved business of any kind, but where I found the way I loved contributing to the business was in HR through the people side. And then I set about learning all I could about it, and went back to school and dove into that for like 10 years. got a number of got a couple of graduate degrees out of it, and a couple of certifications, and really dove in and found a deep love for learning, of all kinds, that continues to this day. Not only technical skills, but learning about the application of that academic background, and how that really works and what it really looks like in the field. So that's my story, and we continue to learn now and apply what we learn every day.
Yeah. No, thanks for that scope. I remember you telling me last time how many employees, but I didn't get the how many locations. So that's
Yeah, yeah,
significant. That's a large coverage, and that's quite a bit of human resources
yes,
that
yeah,
that need to be in compliance and paid, and all of the I'm sure you have all sorts of investigations that you oversee, and it's
yes.
a huge scope that you cover. But what I've found in most folks in your role and position are obviously very passionate about culture and the human experience at work, because we spend so much time at work, and sometimes probably too much time that we spend at work than elsewhere in our activities we love or with our families. But it's just a part of our world and our life that we're in, because our goal of obviously the podcast is to talk to people, whether it's in life or leadership, and we're intentionally talking to on both strands with different guests. But you and I were mostly talking about the organizational space, which is
Hmm.
totally fine. But the goal
Hmm.
is what really helps us move beneath the transaction, because beneath the transaction is where change really occurs. That's where relationships become meaningful. That's where we feel a sense of purpose, sense of belonging. That's where change, in my opinion, really happens. Sustainable change, not just like, oh, we hit these numbers, but
Hmm.
the lasting change. That's the big picture that we're going after in the show.
Yeah, as I reflected on our last conversation, Chris, I think the one of the main things was I love the 7 conditions of your work so much, and I think there's a relational component to that. And what I've always in working frontline and being a frontline worker and in working frontline and then supporting frontline leaders, that work is inherently transactional. And I think the duality there is we talk about cultures a lot and we talk about what it takes to build relationships and we talk about having relationships with our people and building great teams and all those things, but we operate in a transactional space, not a relational one all the time by default because it's what we do with our customers and our tasks every day and whatnot. And I think that duality of that dichotomy almost if it, between where we spend our transactional time and the relational time, especially with frontline leaders, there's an emotional component to your seven conditions and your transformational cultures that you talk about. And because it's not, and because we've trained people to be good at their jobs tangibly, transactionally, that maybe, we need to spend a little more time teaching people how to build relationships and whatnot and have that and share purpose and whatnot. And maybe that's baby steps and, trying a number of those, just saying, maybe this thing's important to me. And
Yeah.
here's why adding a little bit of purpose without making people go out of their comfort zone when they don't know, necessarily how to blend those two things. So I think that blend, that duality, that dichotomy between transactional and relational, especially with frontline leaders, is something that could be beneficial to figure out. And we're always trying to introduce those components and make that a part of culture and leadership development. So love to dive into more of that with you and ask you some questions around that as well.
Yeah, it's a foundational question for me, one that I wrestled with for a long time that led to all of this work and the discovery of these 7 conditions because that was the very thing that I was frustrated with, many years ago, fully funded from a philanthropist to create transformation in a community. Our strategy was let's bring leaders together. And
Hmm.
I just kept seeing over and over again the transaction. People show up with masks on. They don't, you know, th- they say all the right things, but they don't really mean it. And they go their separate ways. And little things happen here and there, but nothing that I would ever call transformational. And relationships are very transactional. And that realization of the handshake versus sharing the breath of
Right.
life. We shake hands with everyone,
Hmm.
and we never remember handshakes. Handshakes are so transactional, like, unless it's some significant moment, like getting a job or a degree, or we meeting somebody, famous, like, we usually don't remember them. And I had that realization where I was participating in that, shaking hands with people I didn't really care for and that I actually didn't like, but on the surface smiling and saying, "Nice to see you." I had that realization and awakening myself. And then I thought of that indigenous gesture, which is important to me. The Philippines, it's called ongo, and New Zealand, it's called hongi, and Hawaii, it's called honi, and it's sharing the breath of life. And it's very different than a handshake. You press your forehead, your nose together, you take a deep, intentional breath. And I mentally just weighed those two things differently to one another. And I ended up getting to see leaders actually do that with each other. And that's another
Hmm.
story for another day, but it was amazing. But the most important part that led to our discoveries was just the contrast between the two and where
Hmm.
it led me to
Hmm.
what I was thinking about. And it almost became sort of this art form to help people to really break out of that. And you had mentioned earlier that, where they're not uncomfortable, I I guess there could it's not impossible to get there and it
Hmm.
not be uncomfortable, but
Hmm.
I would say that those moments are just I don't know how to create those moments where because
Yeah.
the only moments that I know how the only way I know how to help people, break through that transaction like you're mentioning and lean into the relationship more, develop deep relationships, the vulnerability, the emotional side,
Hmm.
it's gonna be uncomfortable. Just like that gesture is uncomfortable, like, you have to you're getting in someone's personal space, but when you do that, it changes everything. Now, I'm not saying that's what you do with employees, but metaphorically, how do we do that? That leads me to another thought of kind of the art form of how I've seen that happen, but first, I just wanna get your reaction. I think I've shared that story like, the full story with you before, and
Yeah.
again, that's chapter 1 and 2 of the book, but what do you think of when I'm telling you that? What comes to mind?
Yeah, I think it's a powerful story, and you're right. The metaphorical part of that is how I think, with frontline leaders, how we have to have that mindset when we walk into a restaurant or we walk into a store or we wherever we're supporting frontline people, is that we have to go in and we have to think relational first before we get to the transaction, because that piece, without the purpose, without that connection, your deep and trusting relationships condition, without building on that, then people just start to feel like transactions. And that's where, if you're supporting a group or you're building a team, you can't only get so much performance out of that. You can only get so much production out of that. And in my experience, you need more than that. And you get more than that. And it compounds when you have those relationships and you have that trust. That's when productivity and whatever other measurable you're going after, that's when that increases. And so I think you have to have that. People just can't feel like they're a checkbox. They have to feel like it's important. And what the trust you've placed in them, the things that are important to you, that you've placed that trust in them, that they feel that and they're able to give that back to you. And then the things that are important to them that they've shared with you, that can live somewhere safe. And I think once you do that, but we don't think about that when we go in and we walk into a location and we're trying to not necessarily just here at Captain D's, but as frontline leaders, when we walk in somewhere, we have to be intentional about people first, relational first. In simple conversations, Chris, I think you have to do that. When you're having a simple conversation with somebody, you have to go relational first, but you're especially if it's a difficult conversation, and you have to go into those relational first, and you have to go into that people focus first without just delivering the message or that kind of thing. And I think if you have that trust that we talked about, those conversations, that relationship survives a hard conversation if you have that trust built up. But going back to what you're saying, I think it's relational first, and I think metaphorically we just have to have that in our heads first. Your forgive me, I forget what you called it, but placing your forehead and your nose together, that metaphorically is what we have to lean into if we want to build productivity for the long term.
Yeah. And with that gesture, metaphorically, what we learn from it is there's intention behind it.
Uh-huh.
And also, there's just a long history behind it. I mean, the fact that that gesture has withstood hundreds, thousands of years, even colonization, and still means the same today as it did to our ancestors long, long ago, tells us that they figured something out in their society to help deepen relationships, to help bring meaning to spaces where a handshake simply will never do. And, interesting story too, actually in Hawaii. And then I did want to kind of dive into kind of more practically speaking, how do we deepen relationships? I want to get to that. But a side story to that gesture, have you ever been to Hawaii?
I haven't yet. It's on the list though.
So I'm not a Hawaiian historian, but I do love, all Asia Pacific culture. But in Hawaii, if you go to Hawaii, they usually refer to white people as haulis.
Okay.
But haole actually doesn't mean white person. And so they'll actually, anybody who's new to the islands, they'll call haole, but most people think it means you're white. But haole actually doesn't mean that at all. Haole means basically in Hawaiian, the word ha-ha is the breath, right?
Oh, okay.
And in aloha is kind of sharing the breath. Aloha, like I'm sharing breath with you. A lot of people say it means like love and what have you. And those are good interpretations, but it's basically aloha, right? Like I share the breath with you. And again, for Hawaiians listening, I don't speak Hawaiian, so this is my interpretation of it, but I think I'm fairly close. Having lots of friends that have taught me, all about this. But so that's what it means. Aloha, right? I'm sharing the breath with you. I think haole is Haole, and it basically means the one without breath. So, and the reason why foreigners got dubbed haole was because when they first came to the islands, they didn't share the breath of life. They probably shook hands, right? They didn't greet each other the way natives greet each other, which is through that gesture, right? Because they're sharing the breath of life, the spirit of aloha. Haoles got called haoles because they were the ones without breath. The ones without life almost, because they didn't greet each other the same way. So that's kind of just an interesting fact of those terms, but that's how they communicate today, right? And how they communicated then was we share the breath with each other. Like that's how we are both human. And when you don't, you're the one that doesn't share breath. So now put that in metaphorical sense, like as leaders or in our organizations, what are we leaving with our employees, even in our families? Are we sharing breath with them? Are we sharing this
Mm,
spirit of aloha with them?
mm,
Or are we just howlies, the ones without breath? What
mm.
are they thinking about when we leave? Like there was no breath in that conversation. There was no life in it. It was purely transactional. It
Right.
was just, I need X, Y, and Z from you, and you do this and I do that, and that was it. And we know our
Right.
roles.
Right.
I think that's what a lot of conversations are. And then in our Western culture, we also run into this wall of like separating home and work, like it,
Mm,
and it's like, well, as soon as I walk through this door, I'm now, I'm Chris and my title. As soon as I leave and I go home, I'm now dad, husband, right? The truth is we're always those things. And so this is not a secret, but this is what I've found over the years to try to get people to open up and to build trusting relationships. And which is why the book's called life and leadership, discovering the 7 conditions that transform life and leadership. Life comes first. That's not leadership and
mhm.
life. I found that when people can see that they are transactional, even at home in their personal life, it awakens them to the reality that, gosh, if I'm that way with people that I say I love the most,
Yes.
then I am certainly that way at work. And it almost creates a level of consciousness or awareness that they didn't have before. And, it took me a while to realize this, but many years ago, I was working at the Arbinger Institute. And have you ever heard of the Arbinger Institute?
I have not.
Leadership and Self-Deception is one of their
Mm,
popular books, Outward Mindset, Anatomy of Peace. And
mm,
anyhow, they've been around a long time. And I was working there and I had a client that was, I would preach things. Their basis of their theory is, we see people as either people or as objects. They're people that matter or they're objects that don't matter. And they have a really great way of talking about it. But I was consulting and talking about this all day. And I remember even having a conversation with one CEO that I was working with that he wanted us to, he was paying for our services organizationally, but all of our conversations were always about him and his son, like his teenage son that he was trying to connect with. That's what the content meant more to him that way
okay.
than it did in his life. So we were
Yeah.
always
Yeah.
talking about that.
Yeah.
And I was a young dad at the time. I didn't really get it yet, and
Hmm.
I only had one child and she was, I don't know, 1.5, 2 years old. And one night it really hit me, like what changes us fundamentally at a transformational level always
Hmm.
starts here and it trickles outward.
Mm,
So it's going to start here and then in our
mm.
personal relationships and into our places of work. Like I've rarely seen it happen the other way around. So I had this realization, and this story is actually in chapters 1 and 2 of the book as well. And with my daughter, my oldest, her name's Eva. She's a preteen now, but this was when she was really young. And my wife
Mhm.
and I were in the process of sleep training her. Do you have kids? Have you been in this?
I don't, but
Okay.
I've heard these stories. Let me hear
Okay.
your
Yeah. So
yeah,
getting her to go to sleep, very
yeah.
difficult as a young parent, and it was our first. She hated it. She loved the process of going to bed. Like she loved bath time and jammies and blah blah blah. She loved all that. But like when you put her in her crib, she wouldn't let you leave. You would just have to stay there until she would drift away into sleep. Which sometimes would take like 2 hours. So it would at the time it was kind of ruining my night. And I was getting a master's degree at the time and I was doing all of my studies in the evening,
Right.
so, like, it was getting in the way of that, and that was just kind of our cycle over and over was that, and I was getting frustrated, and I would often pawn it off to Kenzie, my wife, but she became pregnant with our second, and she was feeling not great in the evening, so I was like, "Okay, I'll handle this," and I remember there
Mm,
became this point where I was so determined to figure this out that I started talking to experienced parents. I even went to the library and was reading books. Like I was figuring out I'm going to figure this out. Like I'm going to crack the code to
you're an
getting it.
academic, man. You did your research.
Yeah, I'm going to figure out how to
Find
get this. I'm going to figure out how to get this
right.
toddler to sleep.
Right.
And so I developed this plan. I devised this plan. I went to the dollar store, got some props. Like I was making it the real deal. And I tried it for a couple nights and it just kind of blew up in my face. It didn't work. It just made it worse. And, I became frustrated again and just resorted back to what I was doing before. Well, I'll get her to bed and then I'll sit there and wait till she falls asleep in misery.
Mhm.
And it quickly became she was this sort of obstacle to my evening of doing what I wanted to do. And one night I'm sitting there she's in the bath and she's splashing and playing, she's 2 years old playing in the tub, and I'm reading a book sitting on this little stool, catching up with reading, and she's trying to get my attention, splashing, and the water kinda gets on the book, and I wanna get frustrated, but I look at her and I see she just wants my attentions.
Mm-mm.
I decide, I sit my book down, I start playing with her, and we have a good time, and I
Of
get her
course.
out, dry her off, lotion, jammies, and she comes back into the bathroom and she's brushing her teeth. That age, she's really just sucking the toothpaste out of the toothbrush. She's like brushing her teeth and she's standing on the stool and I'm brushing her hair. And she's got long dark hair and she's in the mirror. And I look at her and I think to myself, I really love this moment. Like this is what makes being a dad so awesome. And then
That's the
quickly
good
I
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, and then quickly I'm like, but as soon as we go in that bedroom, try to put her to sleep, all hell's gonna break
Right,
loose,
right,
and
right.
I'm quickly like, "This sucks." But I remembered a conversation I had just that day with this CEO I was telling you about, and he was
Mhm.
telling me about how a little bit of curiosity in his son led to him having a totally different conversation and ultimately a transformative moment with his son, like, the night before. So I'm
Oh,
like, maybe I should be a little curious about my 2-year-old. And I'm like, what does that mean? Like she's 2 and like I've tried to get her to learn a good skill going to bed, but she won't learn it. And I've tried everything I can. I've tried to teach her, but it's not working. What I
use your
haven't tried
reasoning skills, young one.
Yeah, but I'm like,
At 2.
what I haven't tried is just trying to learn a little bit more about her.
Yeah. Oh,
So
okay.
a question comes to mind. I'm like, her name's Eva. I'm like, Eva, what do you need from daddy so you can go night night? Still very much focused on an outcome that I want, but I was actually curious a little bit about her. And as soon as I said that, as clear as day, she turned around and she looked at me with these big eyes and she was like, Daddy, I want you to pat me pat me 2 minutes and read 2 books. Like, that was it. Like, pat her back for 2 minutes and read 2 books. I'm like, "Okay, that's it?" So, with a smile on my face, I bring her into Kenzie, we say goodnight to mommy, and then we go in her room, and I pick, like, 2 of the smallest books I can find, like the ones with 1 word on them, the thick cardboard ones,
Yeah, yeah,
Apple,
yeah.
Pear, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
read those to her and I do them in funny voices. It takes all of 2 to 5 minutes, and then she's happy about that, and then she turns on her stomach and says, "Okay, pat me 2 minutes," and I start patting her back
Mhm.
and to put her to sleep, and she's closing her eyes to, like, show me that she's trying, and not
Oh.
even 2 minutes go by, and I say, "Okay, I'm gonna leave now." She says, "Okay, good night," and she, like, puckers her lips for a little kiss, so I give her a kiss, and then I'm backing away. You have to understand, if you even sat up in her room before and gave her the thought that you were gonna leave, she would start screaming and get upset. So the fact that I'm able to, like, stand up and back away, I'm, like, backing away like a bomb's about to go off, like,
Mhm.
but I
Mhm.
get to the door and I close the door, turn off the light, and I'm like, "Okay, I'll come back and check on you." And she says, "Okay, daddy, good night." And I'm already blown away. This never happened before. And I can't believe it. I walk down the hall and I walk past my wife and she's like, "She's already asleep?" And I'm like, "No, I don't know what happened, but she's in there." And I remember being so unfocused that night. I was trying to do some schoolwork and I
Yeah.
went back and checked on her a couple times. She was always awake. Maybe like the third time checking on her, she was finally asleep. But I had a key realization that night, that one, that I was the problem, that I was
Mm.
treating my relationship with my daughter like a handshake, like a
Mm.
transaction. Like, I do this, you do that, and it's over. And I realized that night for the first time, that my relationship with her was strictly transactional. I would come
Mm.
home, we'd eat dinner, we'd do some, we'd, I don't know, do something together as a family, but it was
Yeah,
all in my mind just to get to the end of the day so I could do the things I really needed to do, which was
yeah.
my studies. And she was all a transaction to me. And it kind of broke my heart a little bit that I was doing that. And I finally became aware to it. And now looking back, I started to deploy the same strategy every night. And it wasn't always pat my back 2 minutes or read 2 books. Sometimes it was like, Daddy, let's play a little game or let's sing a song, or never took a long time. But those moments are some of the most treasured moments that I have with my daughter, who's now growing older. And I
Right.
and I would have missed out on those had I stayed transactional. So
Mm.
I moved beneath the transaction, and I wasn't perfect, but
Smart.
that taught me something that's relevant to our conversation, is that it's experiences like those that I've realized I have a problem. I'm too transactional in my relationships. It's made me aware and actually admit that I do that at work, and I do that in the
Yes.
professional space. And once
Yes.
you can get somebody to realize that, then all of a sudden it's not soft and fluffy anymore because what's more important than a relationship with a loved one like your child or your spouse or somebody you care about? That's the most important thing in the world. And if it means that I gotta be a little soft, right, to develop a relationship, then I'll do it any day of the week. Why does that not apply at work? It
Yeah.
doesn't mean I'm gonna go and, develop a best friend relationship with these people, but I do have to reveal myself a little bit. I do have to
And
be a little bit vulnerable to create that. Now back to you kind of with that of,
Mhm.
the intention of developing a relationship, but these people are not just employees. They're human beings that have
Yes.
families and loved ones, and some people are dying to, like, connect that way, and other people don't wanna talk about their family,
At
right?
all. Yes.
So it's
Yes.
like, how do we move beneath the transaction to their humanity and truly build a relationship with them that isn't just, well, I'm the employee, you're the boss, or I'm the boss, you're the employee, and that's it. But there's a human element to it. It's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, well, here's what I think. I was contemplating in between our last conversation, and one, I bet your daughter loves that story now. But I bet she's holding on to that now. It's a beautiful story and a great example. But I think, between our last time, I went back and you were nice enough to let me take one of the assessments. When I look back on it personally, just to be a little vulnerable here, and I scored highest in commitment. And I thought to myself at first I would have thought something else, but it makes sense with the structure and the learning that I do and how we go about operating and whatnot at work. And so I'm like, okay, I can see commitment, but I wanted it to be something else relational. I scored highest in consistency, and I would have thought it was commitment. Excuse me, I got that backwards. But I realized that consistency was probably the oxygen to any kind of relationship building that we were doing. And so I got to thinking about what am I consistently doing then? And what am I consistently sharing or not sharing then? That defines that relationship. And how could we help somebody along with that sort of thing? And what I figured out was I could probably just start with sharing a little more than I do about why something's important. And I thought to your condition of purpose and why something's important. And I got to thinking that, when I share, I don't I don't wanna share because I think the thing should be enough about I don't wanna share with you what I think is important and why, because I think the thing should stand on its own. If I pick the right thing, we should all gather around that. But I realize that people make connections to something, especially with purpose. And so what I've tried to layer in is a little bit of, I don't have to get into some long soliloquy about why this is the right thing and why we should all galvanize behind it, but a little bit of emotional sharing, a little bit if I say, I think this is important to me because of X, or I think we're a better team than that and we can be better than this because. And the purpose the impact we're gonna have here is because of this. And that little bit of sharing, I think is too early to tell the impact that that's having, but I feel better about it. And I think longer term, I got to thinking maybe this is something we could layer in back to that first thing we were talking about, that it's not everybody's default to share, but if you can start with a little bit, like I did, that just said these things are important. Why? That little bit of emotional sharing rather than simply being consistent, which again, I think is great because I think that's the oxygen for people moving forward and getting behind something. But that little bit of sharing, if it's not your default and it's not necessarily mine, but man, I care deeply. It's just not coming across. And so what I started to do is just share a little bit that we can do better X, and we can do better X because we are. And this is important to me because, and start to sharing that way. So I think maybe layering in some of those little things for folks where this is not necessarily the default position might help us a little bit. So I'm going to explore that some and see how that goes.
I think that's a brilliant and simple way to start because you're gonna like I mentioned, there's gonna be people that are longing for that, and then there's gonna be some that are resistant. But we have a responsibility in organizations to set the tone for a culture that can't be built without other people, but to set the tone for it, and there's gonna be some discomfort. So people that are uncomfortable with that or like, when's this gonna end? That's fine because transformation was never a comfortable thing anyways. It's always gonna be a little uncomfortable. There's always gonna be a little bit of vulnerability before something shifts, and adding a little more context or reason or why or story behind why we do what we do, that can be all the difference. In fact, there's a study slash experiment that was done. I don't know the name of it or anything. I know it happened several years ago, but basically, this group bought several random trinkets, like of no value, like of no real value on eBay.
Mhm.
Some of them were just a few cents, like 50, 60 cents. And what they did was they took those and they sent them to professional writers, like storytellers, to write an emotional story about this thing. And then they reposted them to sell them, and they wanted to see how they would sell differently.
Oh,
And
interesting.
one of them was this like ugly little horse head. Like it was just this little, I don't know if what it was made of, like if it was made of
Right.
wood or
Right.
clay, but it was this ugly little horse head, like a trinket or something you'd put on a shelf, but it
Mhm.
has no value. It just, and I think they bought it for like 64 cents. I think that's what it was purchased for. Gave it to a writer to write this story about it, made up story. So not to say that we should make stuff up. So that's not part of the what the point I'm trying to
Right.
make,
Right.
but they created this emotional story behind it, and then
Mhm.
they reposted on eBay. That thing sold for, I think, over $70. Like,
Okay.
64 cents to over $70. That's insane, right? And that's the power of story. That's the power of attaching meaning to a story outside of the fact that it was all made up. I think there's there's really a lot of value there, because when you're talking to your employees or we're trying to explain initiative or why we do something a certain way, it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be a super elaborate or emotional story, but enough it matters to people on the other end. The value behind that thing increases. So
Yes.
our words are power in those moments,
Yes.
because they create narrative and context. And then our emotion and our authenticity behind it, I think, are a superpower, because you and I could say the same thing. Like we could say, hey,
Mhm.
we're doing this new initiative, and we could both go and say that thing with the same story. But if I just say it to say it, that's transactional. If you actually say it and you find meaning in that story and you find a way of why it's really important to you, it's going to come across differently. It's going to make all the difference.
Mhm.
This kind of gets into the realm of like authentic leaders and people that are, are approaching leadership in that way.
Mhm.
But it's the story behind it, to your point. I think that's a great way to do it, and not a hard thing to ask of other leaders, is
You
let's
know,
get go
I
ahead.
I think so because that little what we IO people call that adoption at the subgroup level. There has to be something that to really get something behind to get people behind an initiative or really because whatever's going to fail and your part about transformation. If you really want to transform something, you have to have that adoption. And I think one of the few ways to get that is from that galvanization behind a message. And if that example doesn't necessarily resonate with you, at least it helps you if you have a conversation that's meaningful to somebody, at least it helps you guide a decision you might make today or guide a interaction you might have today. So, we all have that one little thing where somebody said one thing in passing to us at a store, in a park, that was a compliment, or it wasn't a compliment. And it's 20 years later and we remember the thing. You have that ability to do that with employees every day. And you never know what's going to resonate and what isn't. But if you have those little emotions, those little pieces of connection, whatever they might be, that little interaction could carry a lot of weight. And if even if they don't adopt it to what they're doing, again, at least they live a value through it of some kind, or it helps them through an interaction or guides a decision or guides an interaction of some kinds. Yeah, I think it might help going forward. We're going to see how we can layer that stuff in.
Well, and even those that are uncomfortable with it, going back to the idea of, asking people about their life outside of work.
Hmm.
Not everybody's comfortable with that, but I found that it's not always comfortable when you just ask it straight up, like, "So, tell me
Right.
about yourself," because it
Right.
it almost feels I actually don't believe people are uncomfortable with it as much as they feel it's disingenuous, right? I think if they had the relationship, they would love being asked those questions.
Uh-huh.
It's kinda like the difference between I mean, it's all the intent. I could have somebody ask me, "Chris, how you been? How was your weekend?" And it could be like, they're just asking me that because they're just trying to create small talk versus there's some leaders and people in my life when they ask me that, I actually know that they care about the answer.
Mm,
And it's because of how their authenticity, but, there's other ways to ask questions to get to know people in a lot more intentional way, and I found, one of them is when I'm with any new team or group, whether I'm, like, actually the leader of this team or if I'm consulting or even if I'm speaking to a group, sometimes I'll ask simple questions at the beginning, like, "Hey, turn to your neighbor and I want you guys to answer this question," "Who's somebody in your life that has had an impact on you and why?" And or, like what's something that's been difficult that you've gone through that's made you who you are today? Like that's what I ask in generic places, but if I'm coaching somebody, with my employees in healthcare too, I would ask them like, "Look, I've noticed that you work really hard. Like where
mhm,
did you learn that? Like who
mhm.
taught you that?" And then all of a
Yeah,
sudden, I'm now bridging work and something personal to them, and I'm
yes.
making it normal to talk about it. Like, "Hey, I noticed that you're always here early, who instilled that value in you?" Or, like, "I feel like you're so you look like somebody that's had something happen, in your life that's made you the way you are, because you impress me, and I'd like to know what that is, like, tell me what that is." And all of a sudden, people are like, "Okay, now they're not just asking me how my weekend is, they actually really see me, they care," They wanna get to
Mhm.
know me, and I think those sort of questions, when asked with real intent and authenticity, can be taught to leaders and managers, to get people to open up. Have a quick team meeting and you just say, "Hey, let's just let's I got a prompt on the board or whatever today, and this is what we're gonna answer and ask," and it's questions that help bridge, "Okay, we're employees today, but we also are people and we have lives."
Interesting.
So, bring those things together. Another one
That's a
too is, what are you most proud of in life? Like, what have you done in your life that you're most proud of? Things
that's
like
a
that.
great
Sorry.
I it's interesting you say that because, I can't and maybe it's because of, what we do for a living or whatever, but man, I just can't do surface level conversations for very long. I mean, if I'm in an Uber for more than 5 minutes, man, we're getting to know whoever that driver is. Like
Yeah.
I just can't do it, you know? Those things have to be I don't know. I think it's worth getting to know someone. I just can't do surface stuff. So, and a lot of people aren't ready for that. And I think sometimes as leaders, over time, you'll find the thing that resonates with somebody, but you might ask a question like that, or I might ask a question like that. And sometimes people are just not going to share with you. And that's okay. That's okay. At least you asked. Or sometimes they might give you an answer that's like not a rosy one and give you something to work on because their experience with what you're asking for is not yours. And it might get tough. And you have to be ready for that as leaders. So if you're going to get past the surface or to use your verbiage beneath the transaction, man, you've got to be ready. Don't ask if you don't want to know, because I think that intention is where I think to your other condition that trusting relationship, deep and trusting relationships works is, man, it's not always rosy. And if you're going to act on something, man, you got to get in there and don't ask if you don't want to know. And so sometimes I've coached leaders over the years that you know, that's that's the equivalent of an engagement survey that nobody acts on, right? You just asked me what's important to me, or how does this go, or I told you what's important. Does that make sense to you? And you tell me no, it doesn't, and here's why, and here's what this is experience, and here's what you're not giving me to do my job. It's time to act on that stuff. That's the good stuff, and I think we have to retrain our minds that when we don't get good answers or we get answers that cause us to have to work on something, that's the good stuff. That's where the transformation, to use your language, happens.
Yeah.
But we, to your point, we have to have that inner transformation first before we can expect it out.
Yeah. And that's where, like you said earlier, where the consistency comes in, to not give up and, to keep moving. And, sometimes when I've worked with different teams, I do this activity where I'll have a couple volunteers come up and I have them do an air squat competition, like who can air squat the longest, and everybody gets into it and it's funny
Yeah.
and surprising. We can't hold air squats for very long, but people get into it, and after, I use it as this sort of metaphor to talk about, like, well, if it was uncomfortable, right? But what if you did that every day for 30 days? Do you think you would be able to hold it longer than 35 seconds? Yeah, probably, right? What if you did it every day for 6 months? What if you did it every day for a year? So there it's uncomfortable. So this goes back to discomfort as like this cheat code to growth, right? Like it's uncomfortable, but it's helping you grow, right? And you
Interesting.
get stronger and the consistency matters. It
Yeah.
sucks if you just do it once and that's it. Even
Yes. Yeah.
twice, you're like, "Ah, I'm not gonna do that again. That was horrible. I'm sore the next day," you know? But if you do it long enough,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden this thing that was uncomfortable becomes something where you're now stronger and better for it, and the same thing goes with these sort of conversations. It's like, there's a lot of things we do in the workplace that are gonna be uncomfortable, but if you do it enough and consistent enough, it leads to a transformation, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, literally, if you do that air squat physically, our physiology is gonna change, our muscles are gonna change, we're gonna be a new person, to some degree. And the same thing I think goes in our leadership. Our leadership will change. We will change. How we
Mm-hmm.
listen will change. The questions
Mm-hmm.
we ask will change because we were okay with sitting in the discomfort a little bit.
Right.
And
Right.
I think that's a valuable lesson and a major one in consistency, because
Mm.
consistency, the way that I write about it in the book is doing the ordinary with sacred intention, doing the ordinary things with intention every single time, because anybody can just go through the motions, like,
Mm-hmm.
well, here's the checklist. I better do X, Y, and Z. Anyone can do that. And sometimes we have to. But what if I do X, Y, and Z, but with this new intention, like, I'm going to learn something today when I do these things.
Mm.
I'm gonna grow from this. And I know this
Interesting.
thing's hard and I always hate that thing, but I'm gonna lean into it today. I think that little time over time it starts to change us. That's the journey, right? The journey of transformation. But so I think what you're talking about at a practical level in the workplace is spot on, and to not give up and to keep going, especially when it comes to building relationships. Relationships of trust. Trust isn't a prerequisite to a relationship, it's an outcome. So it's like we have to
Mm.
expect to build something together. It's not going to just appear the first time. We'll
That's
look
great.
back after 5 months and realize we've built trust. And I think leaders should name that. I think it's so important to name that. Like when something happens and you have a breakthrough and trust is built, to say, when I first came here, nobody trusted each other and I could feel the disconnect. But now, 5 months later, it feels different to me. Does it feel different to you? And you ask him, like so and so, Sally, Bob, whatever, like, do you feel different or is it just me? And you kind of like let them validate themselves. And
Interesting.
some people still might be like, they're maybe too scared to admit it, but I think if you've built the relationships, you'll feel it, they'll feel it, and then you name it.
Well, that's a great exercise. Yeah, I love that. I love that.
Well, I feel like I've talked more than I should have today.
I probably asked you a lot of questions.
That's
Curious
good.
about it. Yeah.
But in closing, I'll ask you one of these questions that I like to ask people, and you can take it wherever you want, but
Okay.
in closing, I'd love to know what's something difficult that you've been through that has made you who you are?
That's interesting. How deep do I get here? I think there was a confidence at the beginning. I think I fell into retail and found I was good at running a business and thought, there's people that do higher level functions and there's those of us that, are here for those people. And I had confidence about a lack of confidence about being a frontline worker and about my potential, about what I might have been capable of. I was never a very good student as a young kid, graduated high school, just wasn't important to me. And as a result, the times I tried to dabble in college were not very successful. And as a result of that, I thought, well, that's for other people. And that's not and there's those of us that serve other people, and then there's other people. And then I think over time, where I went back to school, and it's difficult. And hats off to anybody, man, who's trying to work and get an education at the same time. That is a whole different level of commitment. And hats off to anybody that can do that. But I think I went back and I started to get some started to get some good grades, and I thought, well, that's not so bad. And I thought, well, you can do this math after all. That's not hard for you to do. And a lot of those self-imposed limits, because of where I was currently or what I found myself doing, it took me a while to realize that, much like your squat example, that if you just start to flex some muscles for a little bit, yes, it's hard at first. And and once I started building some victories on that, internal victories, and I realized that hold on a second, degrees don't necessarily mean smart. And there's a whole lot I can learn from a lot of people. Let me value learning and see where that gets me. And it just so happened I learned to love the academic process. And then, once you start to get a seat at the table, Chris, or whatever that table is for you, you start to move up a little bit, you realize I belong here. These people aren't any smarter than I am. They're not any more capable than I am. And I think that confidence, and I recognize it now in young leaders because I went through it. I just thought I wasn't worthy of that type of thing. But I found that if you put in the work and you start to do the belief and you realize you can have some accomplishments and whatnot, I think that's what shapes me now. When I see that in younger folks or new leaders or whatnot, or I see people in the stores or the restaurants that have just started their careers and are looking to move up. And I really want to try to tell people to embrace their potential and think beyond where they are currently, whatever it is they want to do. There's value in staying right where you are, but I want you to get the value that you want to create, and I want you to get whatever's right for you. But I don't want you to have limiting beliefs of any kind. And I try to I try to spread that because I had them, and now I think they're nonsense, but I didn't at one time. And so it's really about potential. It's about spreading that. It's about letting people know that, and it's about helping people along with that. And I think that's what shapes me now from what once was a limiting belief is now one of sharing growth with other people.
Yeah, starting with the schooling, it's easy to let schooling get in the way of our education. And
That's a great way to put it. Yes.
and kind at work too, whether it's performance or culture or relationships, like we can't let work get in the way of our performance. We can't let work get in the way of our relationships. You can't let work get in the way of our culture we're trying to build. And I think, our job as leaders is to show what it's all about. Just like any good teacher is going to show a student that it's not about school right now. It's about learning, and like you said at the
Man.
beginning of the episode, like you fell in love with learning. And so
Yeah.
your experience was different, the purpose behind it and the motivation was different. But
Hmm.
school is always going to be school. Education and what we learn can be totally different based on you know our outset.
Yeah, you don't need that formality of school for a lot of people. It's
Yeah,
really just about finding what works for you and what you want and going after that. And that's what I want for folks. And that's what we try to enable, on the HR side. We want you to realize whatever potential and dreams you have, if it's with this company or somewhere else. Man, we're humans here. Let's support each other. And that's what it's about for us.
yeah. That's the start of what becomes a great culture, is that attitude. And I love what you said about potential, and we'll close with this because I think we all have an unlimited potential to become. And one of my favorite books is called The Four Agreements.
Mm,
I don't see it on my bookshelf over here.
I'm gonna write it down.
Yeah, Four Agreements. I wish I could tell you the author. I cannot remember his name off the top of my head, but I was fond with the book because he's from Central America, and so he leans into some of his indigenous beliefs of where
Mm,
these four agreements came from. But my favorite one of the four agreements is do your best. And like that's just an agreement you should have with yourself, like always do your best. But he gives caveats during it, like give your best today, because your best isn't always going to be as good as it was yesterday. It might not be as good
mm,
as it is tomorrow, but
mm-hmm.
give your best today. Don't measure it against how you were yesterday or how you might be tomorrow, because
Love that.
context matters, days change, situations morph. And so the most we can do is give our best in the moment. So I love that. And it sounds like a message that you're instilling within your peoples. This was worth it, Sean, to come back together and then have another conversation. So I appreciate your
That's
time.
great. Yeah. Yeah. It's my pleasure, Chris. Always.
Yeah, this has been a great joy. So just formally want to thank you for joining the show, and thank anyone who's tuned in. And I think there's a lot that you can pull from what Sean and I have discussed today, both at kind of a high level theoretical level as well as very practical. I think we've talked about both ends of that, and anything to improve upon our life, and like I just said, be the best that we can be today. So thanks, Sean. I appreciate you. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure.
Okay. All right, everyone. Until next time, thank you.